The letters were still warm from the strongbox when Julian Ferrers, Duke of Aldermore, laid them on the estate office desk and told his wife she had until morning to leave his house. Verity Hale did not look at the letters first. She looked at his hands, which were shaking, though his voice was not, and she thought, with the small, cold clarity that had kept her steady through worse rooms than this one, that a man who trembles and does not raise his voice has already decided something he cannot unsay. She did not yet know that before the next sun rose, it would not be her name struck from the house's books, but his. Had she known, she would have sat down at that desk all the same, folded her hands, and waited for him to finish. The office smelled of tallow and old vellum, the smell it always kept after dark, and the single candle between them threw both their shadows twice the size of their bodies onto the shelves of estate ledgers behind him. "Read them," Julian said, and pushed the papers an inch closer, as though an inch mattered. "Or do not. You wrote them. You hardly need reminding what they say." She read them anyway, slowly, because reading slowly was a thing she had learned from her father, who used to say that a ledger does not lie even when the hand that keeps it does, and that the surest way to catch a lie was to give it enough silence to grow uncomfortable in. The letters purported to be hers, addressed to an agent of Lord Vane, offering him the autumn grain contracts of Aldermore's home farms at a price below market, in exchange for a private sum paid to a bank in Taunton in her maiden name. The hand was close to her own. It was not her own. She set the pages down, squared their corners to the desk's edge, and looked up. "You believe I would sell your harvest to enrich myself," she said, "and you believe it enough to have already written the notice to the parish that I am gone. I have written nothing to the parish. You will, by noon, if I do not do something to stop you. And we both know it." He did not answer that. His jaw did the small work of a man holding a door shut against a wind he had not expected, and for a moment the anger in him looked almost like grief, though she was careful not to name it that aloud. Not yet. Not until she understood which wound it had opened. A year and a day of marriage had taught her that his silences came in several different weathers, and this one she had not catalogued before. "You have until morning," he said again, quieter now, which was somehow worse than the shout he had not given her. "Take what is yours. Nothing that came to you through this house." "Nothing that came to me through this house," she repeated, and something in her chest, some last patience she had been rationing for a year, quietly closed its ledger. "Then you had better sit down, Your Grace, because I am about to tell you exactly what came to me through this house, and what did not, and which of the two of us is standing on the other's ground." He did not sit. She told him anyway. She told him that her father, Edmund Hale, had been a man of business to the old Duke 30 years before either of them was born, and that in the year of the Great Frost, when Aldermore's rents failed and the old Duke's credit failed with them, it was Edmund Hale who had advanced the money that kept the roof on this very room. Secured not by a bond of honor, but by an indenture, drawn in proper form, naming the home farm and the house itself as surety. She told him that the debt had never been repaid in coin, only in a marriage arranged 11 months after her father's death, when the new young Duke's lawyers had come to her, poor and plain and 24 years old, with an offer that dressed an old obligation in a wedding ring and called the bargain settled. She told him, last, the single clause neither his lawyers nor her own grief had thought to explain to her fully until she had read the indenture herself late one night, by this same candle, that the debt was not extinguished by the marriage alone, but suspended by it for a term of 1 year and 1 day, and that if within that term the Duke repudiated his wife, cast her from his house, or declared the marriage at an end without proving before witnesses a lawful cause, the suspension failed, and the debt and the surety behind it came due entire, in the house's own stones. "You gave me until morning," she said, and stood, and for the first time in the conversation her voice did not stay level, though her hands did. "I will not need it. I have somewhere to go. You, Your Grace, married a debt you did not trouble to read the whole of, and you are 7 days short of the year, and a day that would have discharged it clean. Throw me out tonight, without proof, before witnesses who will remember exactly how it was done, and I will not need a year to leave your house. I give you a year to leave mine." He laughed, once, without any pleasure in it, the laugh of a man testing whether the floor beneath him is really gone or only feels that way in the dark, and he said her father's indenture was 30 years dead, and no attorney living would trouble to enforce a debt no one had troubled to collect for 3 decades, and she said nothing further. Only walked past him to the shelf where the estate's oldest deed box sat gathering dust behind newer papers, and set her hand flat upon its lid the way another woman might have set a hand upon a Bible, and left him standing in the candlelight with the forged letters and the true and terrible arithmetic of what he had just done. What neither of them said aloud, though both of them felt it settle into the room like weather, was that 7 days was no time at all to prove a forgery, and that Michaelmas, the quarter day when Aldermore's accounts were struck and its debts called or forgiven, was 6 weeks off, and that somewhere between this night and that one, the truth of the letters, and the truth of the marriage that had never once been asked whether it wished to exist, would have to be dragged into a room with enough light in it for everyone to see. He did not sleep that night, though he would not have admitted it to any living soul, and Verity did not leave, though she had told him she would, because a woman raised on ledgers does not abandon a claim she has only just proved she is owed. She sat instead in the small chamber that had been hers for a year and a day, without ever quite becoming home, and she took down her father's private papers, the ones the estate's own copies did not have, and began, by candlelight, to build her case the way Edmund Hale had taught her to build any case, which was patiently, and from the bottom column upward. It was there that Mrs. Bragg found her near 2 in the morning, having climbed 3 flights on the strength of rumor alone. A woman built like a good loaf, gray hair escaping its cap, a shawl thrown over her nightgown, with the briskness of someone who had buried 2 husbands and outlasted 3 duchesses' worth of household crises, and did not intend to be surprised by a 4th. "So it's true then," Mrs. Bragg said, planting herself in the doorway. "He's turned you out over a lot of paper that isn't yours." He tried to. Verity did not look up from the columns. I informed him it would cost him rather more than he expected. "Good," said Mrs. Bragg, with the satisfaction of a woman who had never in 30 years' service been permitted to say a true thing to a duke's face, and intended to enjoy hearing it said by proxy. "He's his mother's boy when he's frightened, that one. God rest her wicked soul, though it does him no credit to be told so." Verity's pen stopped. This was new ground, offered carelessly, the way the truest things in a house are always offered, sideways and in the dark. She asked what she meant. Mrs. Bragg folded her arms and told her, in the plain, unlovely language of a woman who had scrubbed the family's grief off its own floors for 20 years, that the old Duchess had gone off with a merchant from Bristol when the young Duke was 10 years old, had taken the second-best jewels and left the debts, and that the boy had grown into a man who believed, in the marrow of him, that any woman who came near his money had already decided how much of him it was worth. "He didn't marry you for love, miss, begging your pardon, and he'd tell you so himself if you asked him plain. He married you because the lawyers told him it was cheaper than a lawsuit. But a man can start out paying a debt and end up owning something he didn't order, if he isn't careful, and I have watched him not be careful about you for the better part of a year." Verity said nothing to that for a long moment, because there was nothing in the ledger of her own feelings she was prepared to enter into evidence, not that night, not to anyone, not even to herself with any confidence. She had married a stranger to settle her dead father's debt, and had spent a year and a day learning the weather of his silences without ever once being asked whether she wished to. She said only that a man's reasons for marrying her were his own business, but his reasons for calling her a thief were now very much hers, and she meant to prove them false before witnesses good enough that no lawyer living could pretend otherwise. Mrs. Bragg, who recognized a woman settling in for a long campaign when she saw one, fetched tea instead of arguing, and sat with her until the candle guttered, and it was in that gray hour before dawn that Verity found the thread she had been hunting without knowing it, a discrepancy of £11 4 in the home farm rents for the previous Lady Day, entered in a hand that wished very hard to look like her own, and did not quite understand how she crossed her sevens. She copied the page. She did not yet know whose hand had truly made it, though she suspected, and the suspecting sat in her like a stone swallowed whole, heavy and cold and impossible to put down again. By the time the sun came up, husband and wife had each spent the night proving to themselves, in separate rooms, that neither of them meant to leave without a fight. And though Julian sent no notice to the parish that morning, he sent for his family's trustee instead, a choice that would prove, in the end, to be the only wise thing he did for a fortnight. Sir Aldous Penrose arrived on the third day, a spare, silver-headed man who had managed the Ferrers family's legal affairs for 30 years and had buried the old Duke, the old Duchess's scandal, and 2 chancery suits without once raising his voice, and he read the indenture twice through with the flat, patient attention of a man who has learned that documents, unlike people, do not improve on a second reading if they are lying. He confirmed, to Julian's visible discomfort, that the clause was real, properly executed, and very likely still enforceable, and he confirmed, to Verity's quiet relief, that no court in the kingdom would look kindly on a duke who cast out a wife on the strength of unsworn letters and no hearing at all. It was Sir Aldous who proposed, in the dry voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed because he was rarely wrong, that the household proceed to Michaelmas as though nothing at all were amiss, that the letters be neither believed nor destroyed but held, and that on quarter day, when the estate's accounts were struck before the tenantry as they were every year, the matter be settled properly, before witnesses, with proof rather than temper. "You will not like the delay, your grace," he said, not unkindly, "but you will like a lawsuit rather less, and you will like being remembered as the duke who cast off an innocent wife on forged evidence least of all." Julian did not argue. He had already begun, in the small hours, to doubt the letters on grounds no attorney had given him, grounds made of 100 small, honest things he had watched his wife do, across a year and a day, that did not sit easily beside the picture of a woman selling his harvest behind his back, though pride kept him from saying so aloud to anyone, including himself. Verity, for her part, accepted the 6 weeks as a gift disguised as a sentence, and set herself, quietly and without asking permission from anyone, to finding out whose hand had truly written the letters, and whose hand had truly taken the £11 4, and why. She did not yet say Josiah Crane's name, even in her own thoughts, though it had begun, uninvited, to cross her mind whenever she totaled a column that would not balance, and she understood, with the particular dread of a woman who has learned to read faces before she learned to read Latin, that the man who managed nearly every figure that passed through Aldermore's books had every opportunity in the world to make her handwriting appear wherever it suited him, and that proving it would require more than suspicion. It would require his own hand, caught in the act of being itself, and held up to hers in a light bright enough that no one in the room could pretend not to see the difference. Josiah Crane called upon her the following afternoon in the small parlor that had been the old Duchess's and was now, by unspoken household agreement, no one's, and he came in the manner of a man paying a condolence call rather than a man under any suspicion at all. Which was, Verity thought, the first thing about him she had never quite trusted, though she had never before had cause to name it. He was an immaculate man, close-shaven, his cuffs always white, his voice pitched low and even in every weather, and he smelled faintly of clove and the beeswax he used on the estate's oldest ledgers, a smell she had once found reassuring and now found, without quite knowing why, unbearable. "I have come to say how sorry I am for the unpleasantness," he said, settling into the chair across from her with the ease of a man who had sat in every chair in the house at one time or another, "and to offer what help I can. It cannot be comfortable, being doubted under one's own roof." "It is not my roof yet, by your own accounting," Verity said, and watched him smile at that. A small, appreciative smile, the smile of a man complimenting an opponent's move in a game he still believed he would win. He told her, gently, that these things were often best settled without a public scene, that a woman's reputation, once aired before the tenantry, rarely came home whole again whatever the verdict, and that he would be glad, entirely at his own discretion, and without troubling his grace, to arrange a quiet settlement, a sum sufficient to see her comfortably established elsewhere, in exchange for her withdrawing any claim upon the house before Michaelmas came and made a spectacle of everyone. It was, she understood at once, both a bribe and a threat wearing the same gentle face, and she thanked him for his concern with a composure that cost her a great deal more than it showed, and told him she had every intention of being present at Michaelmas, in the light, before witnesses, and that she trusted the accounts, properly examined, would speak for themselves. Something moved behind his eyes then, quick as a fish beneath ice, gone before she could name it, and he rose, and bowed, and left her with the scent of clove hanging in the room like a warning she did not yet have the words to read aloud. She sat a long while after he had gone, turning over his sentence about the accounts speaking for themselves, and thought that he, of all men in the house, ought to know best of anyone how very much a column of figures could be made to say, and how very little of it might be true. The household, meanwhile, had begun to talk, as households always did, in the particular hushed, relentless way of servants who love their mistress and fear their master, and cannot afford to show either feeling openly. The scullery maids took wagers on whether the Duchess would still be sleeping under Aldermore's roof by All Hallows, and the stable lads swore they had seen a trunk half-packed in her chamber, which was not true, though it made a better story than the truth, which was that Verity had spent every evening since the confrontation not packing, but copying. Page after page of her father's old accounts held up beside the estate's newer ones, searching for the places where the two disagreed. She found more than the £11, 4 shillings. She found a pattern, faint and old and carefully spaced so that no single year's discrepancy would ever draw an auditor's eye, a scattering of small sums bled from timber sales and tenant rents across nearly 6 years, always in a season when the steward's own hand was busiest and least likely to be checked, always dressed afterward in a second entry. Corrective. In a hand that resembled hers just enough to survive a glance, and not quite enough to survive an hour's close comparison by candlelight. She did not go to Julian with it yet. She had learned, across a year and a day of marriage to a man who trusted almost nothing offered to him without proof, that a suspicion presented too early was worth less than the paper it was written on. and that what she needed was not his belief, but his own eyes. Later, in a room with witnesses, seeing the thing for himself. It was over the estate books, oddly enough, that husband and wife came nearest each other in all the weeks between the accusation and the reckoning, though neither of them called it nearness at the time. Sir Aldous had insisted, in the interest of a fair Michaelmas, that the current quarter's accounts be reconciled jointly, the Duke's steward presenting his figures, the Duchess permitted. As mistress of the house and daughter of the debt's original holder, to examine them, and Julian, unable to think of a graceful objection, had found himself most evenings in the estate office across the same desk where he had once laid the forged letters, watching his wife work a column of figures with the quiet, total attention she gave to nothing else, not even to him. He discovered, without meaning to, that she hummed under her breath when a sum came out clean, 3 notes and no more, always the same 3, and that she had a habit, when a figure troubled her, of laying her pen down flat and squaring it to the edge of the page before she allowed herself to say anything at all, as though giving herself one breath's grace before speaking. He discovered that he had begun, somewhere in the last fortnight, to wait for the humming. "You did not learn that from me," he said one evening, nodding at the deftness with which she had caught a transposed figure in the timber accounts that his own clerk had missed twice. "I learned it from my father, who said a ledger does not lie, even when the hand that keeps it does." She glanced up. "You might try trusting the ledgers a little more than you trust the letters, Your Grace. Letters can be written to please a reader. Figures, correctly kept, please no one. That is why they are worth believing." He almost smiled at that, the corner of his mouth moving before he caught it and stilled it, and she saw the catching and understood it for what it was. A man unused to being amused by his own wife and unsure what to do with the sensation. She did not press it. 2 evenings later, when Mrs. Bragg brought in a tray and spilled, by design or accident no one ever established, an entire jug of small beer across Crane's carefully resorted quarter-day papers, Julian laughed, a short, surprised sound entirely without his usual guard on it, and Verity found herself smiling before she had decided to, and Mrs. Bragg, retreating with the empty jug and a face of perfect wounded innocence, caught Verity's eye in the doorway, and did not bother hiding her satisfaction at having, by her own account afterward, engineered the first genuine laugh out of that boy since his father's funeral. It was that same week that Verity told him, carefully, one part of what she had not yet told anyone, that she had been quietly repaying, out of the last of her own small inheritance, several tenant families she had reason to believe had been overcharged on their rents in past years, families too frightened of the steward's good opinion to complain of it themselves. She did not tell him why she suspected the charges were wrong, or whose hand she believed lay behind them. That, she told herself, was a debt she was not yet ready to call in, not until she held the proof entire, and she watched Julian absorb the confession with a stillness that told her he understood she had given him only part of a larger truth, and that he had decided, for reasons of his own, to let her keep the rest a little longer. The blow came on a wet Tuesday, 10 days before Michaelmas, when Josiah Crane presented himself in the estate office, not with quiet sympathy this time, but with a second sheaf of letters, discovered, he said, tucked behind a false panel in the old steward's desk that had been Edmund Hale's office 30 years before. Letters that appeared to show correspondence stretching back months between the Duchess and an agent of Lord Vane, arranging not merely the sale of a season's grain, but a standing understanding by which Aldermore's harvest contracts would be quietly diverted, year upon year, to enrich a fund held in Verity's name at a Taunton bank, the same £11 4 shillings and its scattered kin now recast, with horrible neatness, as the opening entries of her own private fraud rather than his. Worse, Crane produced, with the mild, regretful air of a man laying down cards he wished he did not hold. A note in which the very sums Verity had spent repaying the overcharged tenants were characterized as payments made to buy their silence, evidence not of conscience, but of guilt, attempting to cover its own tracks before discovery. Julian read the second sheaf standing, and Verity watched something in his face, close like a door pulled to by a wind, watched the 10 days of small trust they had built collapse under the particular vertigo of a man who has been betrayed once by a woman's hand and had believed, against his own history, that this time might be different. The tenants, he said, and his voice had gone very flat, very careful. The voice she now knew meant he was holding something enormous entirely still. You told me you helped them. You did not tell me why you thought they needed helping. Because I was not certain yet, she said, and because an accusation without proof is only another forged letter, dressed in better manners. That is a very convenient reason to have said nothing. It is the true one, she said, and did not raise her voice, though everything in her wanted to, which you would know, if you had spent the last 10 days learning to trust figures instead of fear. He did not answer that. He set the letters down, very precisely, and told her that Sir Aldous would see the new evidence before Michaelmas, and left the room without another word, and Verity sat alone with the rain on the window and understood. With the particular clarity that comes only at the worst moments, that what had looked like safety, the 6 weeks Sir Aldous had won her, had just become instead the very trap the letters had been built to close. Sir Aldous came the next morning, grave and unhurried as ever, and laid before her, without preamble, an offer he called, with visible distaste for his own errand, the most sensible course available. The new letters, whatever their origin, had shifted the ground. A public tribunal at Michaelmas now risked airing a scandal broad enough to touch not only her name, but the Duke's credit with every bank and factor from Bristol to London, at the very season his harvest contracts most needed steady faith behind them. If she would sign a private deed relinquishing all claim under her father's indenture, and quit the house before quarter day, a settlement would be made, generous enough, he said carefully, to establish her and any dependent relation in comfort for the whole of her natural life, and no word of forgery, true or otherwise, need ever reach a tenant's ear. It was, she understood at once, Josiah Crane's own offer returned to her in more respectable clothing, carried this time by an honest man who did not know whose hand had truly guided it toward him. She thought of her aunt, Prudence Hale, alone in a damp cottage on an annuity too thin to keep the roof mended, who could be lifted at a stroke out of every winter's worry by the sum Sir Aldous now offered. She thought of how simple it would be to take the money and let the world believe whatever it liked of a woman it had never troubled to know. She set her pen down, squared to the edge of the untouched deed, and told him, in a voice that did not shake, though the cost of steadiness sat in her chest like a stone, that she would not sign it. I did not marry into this house to be bought out of it a second time, she said. My father was owed a debt honestly, and I mean to be found honest in the collecting of it, whatever it costs my comfort. If I take your money and go quietly, every soul in this parish will believe forever that a Hale sold Aldermore's harvest for coin, and my father's name will lie under that stone beside his grave until someone troubles to dig it up. I would rather be poor and proven than comfortable and doubted. Sir Aldous looked at her a long moment, the look of a man revising an opinion he had not known he held, and folded the unsigned deed back into his case without another word of persuasion, and it was that refusal, made in a cold room with no one but an old lawyer to witness it, that would matter more, before the month was out, than anything either of them yet understood. She left the house 3 days later, all the same, not banished but withdrawn, on her own decision, to the dour cottage at the edge of the park, telling Mrs. Bragg only that she would not stand accused under a roof where the man who owned it could not yet look at her without flinching, and that she meant to spend what days remained before Michaelmas finishing what she had started, rather than defending herself daily against a silence she could not argue with. Julian let her go, which she understood, with a bitterness she did not examine too closely, to be its own kind of answer. The storm that broke over Aldermore 2 nights before quarter day was the worst in 11 years, tearing slates from the stable roof and flooding the lower meadow black under a sky-lit white every few minutes by lightning that showed her, each time, the same small square of cottage window and the same rain blurred dark beyond it. And it was in the worst hour of that storm, past midnight, that a rider came down from the London road, half drowned and half lost, asking for the Duchess by name, carrying a packet that had traveled 4 days to reach her, a letter from her father's own old clerk, retired these 15 years to a parish in Dorset, who had read in a Bristol newspaper's gossip column of trouble at Aldermore, and had written, unprompted, to say that he still held, in his own keeping, the original counterpart of the Hale indenture, executed in duplicate as the law required, together with a small daybook of Edmund Hale's kept in the last year of his life, in which the old clerk believed, though his memory of it was 30 years faded. There was some note concerning a young steward's debts and a sum advanced against his wages that he had never troubled to collect. Verity read the letter twice by candlelight with rain still running from her hair onto the page, and felt the shape of the whole scheme turn over at last and show her its true underside, and understood that she held, for the first time, not merely a suspicion, but the beginning of a proof that could stand in daylight before witnesses. She did not yet know whether the daybook itself would arrive in time, whether the storm-drowned roads would let a second messenger through before Michaelmas dawned, and it was on that single, unanswered question, whether the proof would come before the reckoning or only after it was too late to matter, that she lay awake the rest of that black, thundering night. The daybook arrived the following afternoon, mud-splashed and travel-worn, carried the last 5 miles by a farm boy who had found the coach stuck to its axles in the lane, and walked the parcel in himself rather than see it lost, and Verity paid him a whole crown for it, and did not count the cost. She spent that evening and the whole of the next day at the cottage table with her father's daybook, the old duplicate indenture, and every scrap of Aldermore's current accounts Sir Aldous would allow her to borrow, laying them side by side under good clear light, and what emerged, entry by patient entry, was a story 30 years long, that Edmund Hale, in the last winter of his life, had quietly advanced a sum of £40 against the wages of a promising young under-steward named Josiah Crane, to pay for medicine and a physician's care for the man's consumptive daughter, and had noted, in his own hand, that the debt was to be forgiven entirely should the girl not live out the year. That the girl had not lived out the year, and that Crane, whether from shame or pride or some tangle of both, had never once acknowledged the forgiveness, had instead spent 3 decades believing himself in his dead benefactor's debt, watching Verity arrive at Aldermore 24 years old and penniless and worth, in his private reckoning, nothing at all beside the fortune he believed her father's family had once been owed and had let slip through carelessness, and had begun, some 6 years past, to take back in secret what he had convinced himself the Hale family would never trouble to collect honestly, first from the estate's timber, then from its rents, covering the gaps in a hand practiced enough, after so many years managing Verity's own increasingly familiar handwriting in the household books, to imitate it well enough to survive a glance. She sent word to Sir Aldous that night. She did not send word to Julian directly, not yet, because she understood, with the same cold clarity that had carried her through the first terrible night, that the proof she now held would mean nothing shouted across a private room. It needed a public table, a full light, and every witness Michaelmos would gather, and she meant to give it exactly that. And no sooner. Word of the packet from Dorset reached Josiah Crane by the ordinary, unglamorous channel of servants' gossip, 2 days before Michaelmos, and though he said nothing to anyone that betrayed him, Mrs. Bragg, who had made it her business for 30 years to notice what men's hands did while their faces stayed composed, marked that his own hand shook, very slightly, pouring his evening glass. For the first time in all the years she had watched him pour it. He called that same afternoon on Thomas Figg, the underclerk who kept the estate's day-to-day accounts under his direction, a nervous, decent young man with a widowed mother in the village and a habit, Verity had noted months before, without understanding its meaning, of never quite meeting anyone's eye when the quarterly figures were discussed. What passed between the two men in the muniment room that afternoon no one overheard in full, but Figg was seen afterward, pale and shaking, walking the long way round the park rather than through the house, and it was Mrs. Bragg again, watchful as ever, who caught him at the kitchen door past supper and, with the particular fearless tenderness of a woman who has fed half the parish through its worst hours, sat him down, put bread and cheese in front of him, and told him plainly that whatever he had been made to do, the telling of it honestly before Michaelmos would cost him a great deal less than the keeping of it silent afterward. He did not confess to her that night, but he did not sleep, and in the morning, when Verity came quietly to the kitchen door to return a book Mrs. Bragg had lent her, she found Thomas Figg waiting there, gray with 2 nights' want of sleep, holding a folded paper he would not yet let go of, and she understood, before he said a single word, that Michaelmos would not need to manufacture its proof, after all. Only receive what was already coming to meet it. Michaelmos morning came in clear and cold after the storm, the kind of high blue day the county remembered for years afterward as the day of the Aldermore reckoning, and the great hall was fuller than it had been in a generation. Tenants and freeholders come for the customary striking of accounts standing shoulder to shoulder along the walls. Lord Vane and his daughter Lady Cordelia seated with the neighboring gentry near the dais, Sir Aldous at the long table with the estate's books open before him, and Julian at the head of it in his father's old chair, his face composed into the stillness Verity had learned, across a year and a day, meant he was holding something enormous entirely still. She stood, by her own request, not beside him, but apart, near the table where the proofs would be laid, because she meant this to be seen as her case argued on its own feet, and not a wife sheltered behind her husband's rank. Sir Aldous opened the proceedings plainly, stating that 2 sets of correspondence had been laid before the House purporting to show fraud on the part of the Duchess, and that in the interest of the estate's honor and every tenant's confidence in its accounts, the matter would be examined here, in full daylight, before it touched another word of gossip. Josiah Crane, asked to present the letters and the ledgers on which the accusation rested, did so with his usual composed grace, laying each page before Sir Aldous with the unhurried competence of 30 years' faithful service, and for a moment, watching him, Verity understood exactly why no one had ever doubted him before. Gilt so well-dressed looks to an unsuspecting eye. Exactly like honesty. It was Verity who asked to speak first, and Sir Aldous, who had agreed to it the night before, granted her the floor. She did not raise her voice. She laid, side by side upon the table, where every eye in the hall could reach them, 3 things. The original counterpart of her father's indenture, its seal, and Edmund Hale's own hand unmistakable even after 30 years. Her father's last daybook, opened to the entry recording £40 advanced to a young Josiah Crane, and the note, in the same steady hand, that the debt was forgiven upon the death of the steward's daughter. And finally, the disputed letters themselves, laid beside a fresh page in Crane's own current, undisguised hand, taken that morning from the very ledger he had brought to accuse her with. "I ask every soul in this hall who can read to look at these 4 pages," she said, "and tell me honestly which 2 match." A murmur went round the room like wind through standing corn, tenants leaning close, Lord Vane himself rising half out of his seat to look, and it was Lady Cordelia Vane, of all people, seated near the front in silk that had never once been mended, who said into the hush, in a voice gone suddenly uncertain, that she had received letters herself from Josiah Crane not 2 months past, soliciting her father's interest in a grain contract on terms she had thought, at the time, oddly generous, and that the hand in those letters, now she looked, was the very hand laid before them on the table, not the Duchess's at all. It was the crack Verity had been waiting 6 weeks to see, and Crane, for the first time in 30 years of composed and gentle service, said nothing at all. Sir Aldous turned then to Thomas Figg, standing white-faced near the wall with the folded paper Mrs. Bragg had coaxed out of him that morning, and asked him, in the plain, unadorned language a magistrate uses when he already half knows the answer, whether he had copied any part of the disputed correspondence at Mr. Crane's direction. Figg's hands shook so badly he could not at first unfold his own paper, and it was the silence before his answer, long enough that the whole hall seemed to lean into it, that told the room more than his eventual words did. "He told me it was for the Duchess's own good," Figg said at last, "to make her hand match some old letters he said needed copying fair. I did not know what they would be used for. I swear before God I did not know until it was already done, and by then I did not know how to undo it without losing my mother's roof along with my own place." His voice broke on the last of it, and no one in the hall laughed, because there was nothing in a frightened young man's ruin to laugh at, and Sir Aldous, gently, asked him to read aloud the note in Crane's own hand that had accompanied his instructions, a note Figg had kept, out of some instinct for self-preservation neither man had anticipated needing, folded inside his prayer book for 2 months. The note, read aloud in Figg's unsteady voice into a hall gone entirely silent, instructed him plainly to render the copied hand as near the Duchess's as his skill allowed, and to destroy the instruction itself once the work was done, an instruction Figg, in his fear, had been unable to bring himself to obey. It was, everyone in that hall understood at once, the villain's own written word come back to convict him more surely than any accuser could have managed alone. Josiah Crane did not deny it. He stood a long moment with every eye in the hall upon him, and something in his composed and immaculate face came finally, publicly, apart, not into anger, but into a kind of exhausted grief that made him, for the first time since Verity had known him, look his true age. He said, quietly, that he had served this family faithfully for 30 years, that he had watched 3 generations of it spend more on a season's gloves than he earned in a year, that he had buried a daughter on a steward's wages while believing himself in debt to the one family that might have saved her, and that when he learned, too late for it to comfort him, that the debt had been forgiven all along and he had spent 30 years hating a kindness he had never troubled to ask after, something in him had simply broken and stayed broken, and he had told himself, across 6 careful years, that he was only taking back what circumstance already owed him. He did not ask for mercy. It was Verity, oddly, who spoke for it, stepping forward before Julian could pronounce whatever judgment sat visibly gathering behind his still face, and said that a man who had spent 30 years grieving a daughter and a debt he never understood was forgiven, had suffered a wrong of his own long before he began committing one, and that ruin heaped on ruin would mend nothing. Not Fig's frightened honesty, not her own name, not the tenants he had quietly cheated for 6 years, and whom she had already, in secret, begun repaying. She proposed, and Sir Aldous, after a long look at Julian, agreed that Crane be dismissed from his post without prosecution, his years of true service acknowledged in a small pension sufficient to keep him from want, on the sole condition that he quit the county entirely and trouble no tenant of Aldermore again. Not kindness earned, she said plainly, but protection owed to the innocent people, Fig chief among them, who did not deserve to carry a scandal that was never theirs to bear. Julian, after a silence long enough that the whole hall held its breath through it, agreed, and it was done, in the light, before witnesses, exactly as the doctrine of that house had always demanded truth be settled, not with a blow, but with a question asked precisely enough that no lie could survive its answering. The hall emptied slowly, the way a held breath leaves a body, tenants drifting out into the cold, bright afternoon, already reshaping the morning into the story they would tell for years, and it was in the last of the light through the tall windows, with only Sir Aldis's papers left rustling on the table and Mrs. Bragg weeping without shame into her apron by the door, that Julian crossed the empty hall to where Verity stood gathering her father's daybook back into its wrapping, and stopped a pace short of her, the way a man stops short of a threshold he is not certain he has been invited to cross. "I gave you until morning," he said, "and you gave me a year. You have used 6 weeks of it proving me a liar, and 1 morning proving me right," she said, though there was no anger left in it now, only the particular tiredness of a battle honestly finished. "I have some months left of the 12, if you are still counting. I am not counting the debt any longer," he said. "I have already told Sir Aldous to strike the indenture from the books entire, satisfied, whatever the courts might say of a man discharging 30 years of interest in a single stroke. The house is yours by right, regardless of what becomes of the rest of it. I did not want you to stay because a paper says you must." He told her then, plainly, standing in the last light of the hall, with no lawyer and no letters between them, the thing he had not managed to say across a year and a day of careful, guarded coexistence, that he had married her to settle a debt and had spent every week since discovering, in small, unwilled increments, a woman he had never troubled to imagine. One who hummed 3 notes over a column that balanced and squared her pen to the edge of a page before she let herself speak and had refused, at real cost to herself, a fortune that would have bought her comfort and her silence both. "I am not asking you to stay because the house is yours," he said. "I am asking you to stay because I find I do not want to live in it without you. And that has nothing whatever to do with any indenture either of your father's clerks ever drew. Marry me again, Verity, if you will have the offer twice from the same fool, not to settle anything, only because you wish it. It is the only reason I will take." She did not answer at once, because some things, honestly weighed, deserve their full silence before they are spent, but when she did answer, it was with her hand out flat upon the table between them, the same gesture she had used to steady herself the night he had first accused her, and he understood it, this time not as a wall raised, but as a hand offered, and took it. They were married again, quietly, by the parish rector, on a bright morning 3 weeks later, in the small chapel at the edge of the park rather than the great church in the county town, with no more than a dozen souls present, Mrs. Bragg chief among them, weeping openly through the whole brief ceremony, and telling everyone within earshot afterward that she had known it would come to this since. The night of the spilled small beer, a claim no one troubled to dispute. Lady Cordelia Vane, whose honesty in the hall had cost her father a season's embarrassment and won her, in the county's slow reckoning, a good deal more respect than she had held before it, stood as witness and was heard to say, with the dry good humor of a woman who had learned something valuable about the difference between a polished manner and an honest one, that she had come to Aldermore once hoping to be a duchess, and had left it, instead, glad to have become a friend. Thomas Figg kept his place under a new steward of Sir Aldous' choosing, his mother's roof secure, and was married himself within the year to a farmer's daughter, who thought none the less of him for a fright honestly confessed. Josiah Crane took his pension and a small cottage in a distant county, and Verity sent him, every Michaelmas after, a letter with no reproach in it at all, only news of the harvest, which he answered, each time, a little more like a man learning slowly how to be forgiven. Prudence Hale came to live at the Dower Cottage that same autumn and never wanted for coal again. And on an evening a year later, almost to the day, with the same robin singing in the same hedge outside the same window, Verity sat once more at the estate office desk with a ledger open before her, and heard footsteps behind her that she now knew by their weight alone, and did not need to turn to know whose hands settled warm on the back of her chair. "You are working late again," Julian said. "Some habits outlast their reasons," she said, not looking up, though she was smiling, "and some are worth keeping regardless." He bent and set, not a stack of forged letters this time, but a single sheet before her, a fair copy of the year's true accounts, balanced to the last farthing, and said that he had come to give her something, this time, rather than to take it away. "You gave me a year once," he said. "I find I would like to give you the rest of them, if you will still have me for keeping." She set her pen down, squared it to the edge of the page, and told him that a ledger, honestly kept, always came round in the end to balance, and that she supposed a marriage, if both parties stopped keeping score of what the other owed, might do the very same. If this is the kind of story that warms something loosening and quiet in your chest, the kind where a woman's patience turns out to be the sharpest instrument in the room, then pull your chair a little closer to the fire. Because there is always a kettle on here, and always a place kept for the ones who like their happy endings, honestly earned. Tell me in the comments which line you would have spoken back to that Duke on the first cold night, and if you found yourself hoping, the way I did writing it, that Josiah Crane's letter came back to him kinder than he deserved. Stay a while longer if you can. Subscribe if you would like a chair kept warm for you here every time a new story is told. And whatever house you find yourself keeping the accounts of tonight, may you keep them the way Verity did, with mercy on the credit side, and be gentle, always, with the ones who never stopped counting on you.